My name's Carl. I'm from the University of Leeds, as you've just mentioned, and I teach journalism, so I'm a lecturer in journalism practice. We've also got Dan McKinney, who is a learning technologist, and Dr. Danielle Millier, who's also a learning technologist as well at the University of Leeds. And thank you very much for inviting us today to talk about our project, which is the Newsday VR. There's two versions of this, which we will go into as we go forward. If you're from the UK, we're going to take you back to COVID times a little bit now, because every time we need to switch slides, I'm going to say, next slide, please. So if you remember those COVID points from the Prime Minister, then that's what we're going to be doing. So next slide, please, Dan. So the Newsday VR is built around three pedagogies, really. It's experiential learning, industry-aligned tasks, and critical reflection. For me, I believe that students gain knowledge and skills through carrying out the activities and the tasks that are aligned to the industry. And research shows that active participation, allowing learners to apply concepts in a real-world setting, and tasks that you would have to do in industry, really helps them to understand the key concepts, but also builds them ready for the industry as well. So we're then sending out job-ready students into industry. Once students have done the tasks within the sessions, I get them to critically reflect on their own and their peers' work, identify areas for improvement, and critically how to achieve this next time. And I think this encourages deeper learning by linking personal insights to broader theories or professional practice. So Newsday VR is built upon our journalism news days, which we do at the University of Leeds. And that's where students come in and they run a newsroom. So it could be a radio newsroom, it could be a TV newsroom, or an online newsroom. And they react to the day's news and then cover those stories like you would in a real newsroom. And then they ultimately either create a radio program, a TV program, or they're creating online news as well. But teaching that, I realized that there was a bit of a gap when it comes to reporting on what we call trauma stories in newsrooms. So I've worked as a journalist for 25 years. And I know what it can be like to go out and cover these kind of stories. And when I'm talking about trauma stories here, I'm talking about things like terror attacks. I'm talking about murders. I'm talking about those kind of big stories that you hear in the news quite a lot. Quite recently in Southport, there was the stabbing of those little girls. And whether you're fresh out of university and early in your career as a journalist, or whether you've been in the industry a long time, if you're on shift that day when one of these stories happen, you will be sent out to cover that story. And I wanted to be able to give students the opportunity of covering these kind of stories in a safe environment of the classroom, but I couldn't obviously create these stories every time we did a news day. And that's where the VR News Day comes in. Now, one thing I know as a journalist, and the research backs this up as well, industry is really bad at looking after journalists, looking after ourselves. We don't really want to talk about things that are happening. So, for example, if I'm sent out to cover a breaking news story and it's quite traumatic, when I get back to the newsroom, I don't really want to say, oh my goodness, that was a really tough story, because you feel that your editor might think that you are not up to it, or maybe next time there's a big story, you might not get sent out on that. And that kind of mindset is in a lot of newsrooms. And it's only now that newsrooms are waking up to the fact that, you know, journalists do need this kind of support. And a survey that was done in last year found that 93% of journalists, so there was interviews with journalists, and 93% of 120 journalists that were interviewed said that they faced mental health challenges on the job, but didn't really get support from their employers. And a stat is that 56% of journalism students said that there's no mention of mental health in classrooms. So that's where the thinking is behind our Newsday VR. If we go to the next slide, please, Dan. So when it comes to putting it together, I'd seen at the University of Sheffield, they were using VR to take students cover it through a particular news story where they covered just a normal news story that you would cover every day. And that was done by Lindsay Pantry. So I thought, right, talking to Dan and to Danielle, I thought, is there a way that we can take VR and then put a trauma story into VR so then we can cover it like they're doing at Sheffield, but rather than they were just covering normal stories, could we use VR to cover a trauma story? So we reached out to Lindsay Pantry, who had introduced VR at the University of Sheffield, and we had a little chat with her. And that's where Newsday VR 1.0 came from. Because initially I wanted to rush ahead and do this trauma news day, but Dan and Danielle said, slow down, let's do a proof of concept first. So Newsday VR 1.0 brought together a situation where students would cover a drugs raid story in VR, and then there'd be set challenges as they go along. They would interview a few people in the VR headset, hear what the stories were that they were saying. So we got some of our friends and colleagues to act out the roles of bystanders who had seen this drugs raid go on. And we threw some questions in there, or some challenges to the students where they had to decide whether it was authentic information they were given. There was some red herrings as well, with a bit of misinformation given there. And then students had to create a piece of journalism from the first VR news day that we did. And that was made for £10, thanks to a few favours that we called in. Then it comes to Newsday VR 2.0. Now, this focuses, as I mentioned, on well-being alongside the reporting. So what students will be doing now, we've built in a lot more on options for students to choose what they do, and that'll have consequences from what they've chosen. So Newsday VR 2.0 focuses on that well-being side, and students navigate the scenes of making real-life decisions before we then stop and reflect on well-being. So they arrive at the news day. It's a blended approach as well, because some of the tasks are outside of the VR and some of the tasks are inside the VR as well. And then they have to create a TV news report. They'll do a live TV news report. But the thing that we do as well, there's some quite distressing actors. So we got some actors involved in this one to make it more realistic for the students, rather than seeing the tutors and their friends acting out. So we got some actors involved, and they were local actors, which Dan will talk about in a few minutes' time, to act this out. And the students are in the VR. And then when it comes to some of the trickier moments where it would be, if this is what you would face in industry, how would you handle that situation? We're going to stop and we're going to say, right, how do you feel at that moment? You've just covered something that's quite serious there, quite worrying, quite traumatic. How are you feeling? And the students will have these discussions. And that's been brought about as well. We've got I've been working with Media Strong and some researchers who have done work around trauma reporting, and we've got some like a framework to work on, where the students can look at this framework and see how it works within this actual reporting. Dan. So I'm going to introduce Dan McKinney now. So Dan is one of the learning technologists, as I say. And this is where Dan and Danielle come in. They come in with the VR side of it and all the technology side.
Cheers, Carl. Sorry, I'm just navigating around various windows and screens. Hello, yes. So as Carl was describing there, this was already like an existing workshop when Danielle and I were brought on board. So we weren't starting from scratch. There was a pre-existing structure in place for student learning. So it was a really nice starting point to have the Newsday workshop there to begin with. Danielle and I hadn't had much experience like building for VR before. So we were able to speak to some colleagues and we're shown a couple of frameworks. DICE, if you haven't heard of this before, it was one of those frameworks that we were shown. So this allows you to assess the suitability of your idea in VR, asking the question, is it kind of utilizing the affordances of VR? And Carl's idea, when he presented it to us, did fit quite well. So dangerous, it might be considered dangerous to train journalism students in real life, especially on the more traumatic news stories if they haven't been trained how to do so. It could be considered expensive to run like, in-person role play for the curriculum each year. So that gave us kind of the go-ahead, the green light to start making this for VR. Another framework that we looked at was CAML, so the Cognitive Affective Model for Immersive Learning. This is a paper by McCransky and Peterson. They essentially synthesized a bunch of existing work on immersive virtual reality. So not so much a literature review. They did this in the context of education, kind of brought it all together to create this theoretical framework. So a little bit daunting at first glance, but very briefly, at its core, what you've got here is the idea of presence and agency. These are your affordances of VR. Presence being the feeling of being there for the student, so being immersed, and then agency, the ability to make choices. So the technological factors on the left there feed into presence and agency, influencing how the students feel and think, which is represented then by the affective and cognitive factors. Some of these you may want to increase or decrease. Interest, motivation increase, cognitive load, let's try and decrease that. And then these influence and shape how the learning outcomes are experienced. So what it's essentially saying is, don't just rely on VR, which is the medium. Rely on combining it effectively with the method, which is in this case is the workshop, to create that effective and meaningful learning. So for Danielle and I, we started with the script from Carl, which allowed us to start to prototype it as an interactive experience for students. So you might recognize that. We used Miro to begin with, just moving around Post-it notes. We then moved on to ThingLink, and we were able to add placeholder scenes to assess the timing. So how long would it take for students to use the resource? How would it fit within the existing workshop? And this allowed us to kind of plan if there are any other kind of assets that we needed in terms of scenes and text to assist with that narrative flow. So we quickly realized this wasn't going to be a full-on kind of choose your own adventure. The more branches you have, the more complicated and the more production work is involved. So to start with, it was relatively linear, but then we were able to achieve a couple of kind of meaningful choices for the students in the experiences throughout. So in the first iteration on the screen there, you've got the last scene, the students are attending a police conference, and they have only enough time to ask one question. So each student will choose a different question, and then that kind of paved the way for kind of better reflection and discussion in the workshop as they approach their formative assessments with different information. So that was giving them some choice during the design of the VR experience. We then decided, obviously, this was going to be like 360 videos, so no 3D environments to help with the immersion and the presence. So these are our 360-degree environments. Apologies, I couldn't get a better video in time. So this is kind of trying to show we've got that kind of 360 environment that students can navigate. And to drive the story forward, we created a few assets to go with it. Excuse me. So part of the story is calling the police press conference and checking out social media. So these were able to be created just in Photoshop and Illustrator using online generators. We fed the content in and we were able to save these images. We wanted to, we knew Carl wanted to kind of push this further in the second iteration. And there was an activity going to be where the students were actively looking for a new story at the beginning of the workshop. So this was quite an interesting challenge. So we immediately got to work on building this and testing it in VR. Some emails were written from like the news editor. We put them on like the proper templates, screen grabs, made them look as real as possible, not necessarily like on a screen. And then there were buttons in VR to kind of scroll between them. And this was over like a 4-minute time frame. So they would come in and appear as if they were coming into your inbox. The way this was presented in VR, and we learned this especially from like the user testing, it wasn't great and caused quite a bit of confusion. So we realized one of the main issues was, in order to read both the social media and the emails, they had to almost like look across a 180 field of vision. So that was no good. There was plenty of lessons learned during that testing. What we did instead is we turned to Gen AI. So we're not coders, but we're able to get Copilot to write some HTML code, and with a bit of kind of iterative prompting, we're able to build what you can see here, and this will be run in the workshop next week. So you've got very simple screens. The students can interact with these, scroll through them, and then over that time, they're able to kind of see new social media posts and emails come in as this breaking news story starts to emerge. So very briefly, Carl already touched upon this, the difference between the first iteration and the second one. We're really trying to heighten immersion in this as much as possible. So we went from no budget to a larger budget, calling in favors from staff to hiring local actors. But lastly, in the first iteration, you can see in the image on the left there, within the 360 environments, we have the students play like 2D screens. And this was slightly immersion breaking. You can see there, it looks like the person has tiny legs. And this was fed back to us. I can't remember if it was user testing or students. So we wanted to move away from that. And this time around, we've used full 360 videos throughout. So it's kind of pushing the software to its limits. But we feel like we've achieved a slightly higher level of immersion through that. I'm going to pass you over to Danielle now to talk a bit about accessibility.
So we use CenarioVR as our platform for building this, but by its own submission, it's not accessible at all. So we decided for it to be more inclusive and for people to use it out of VR as well. We built a separate but a parallel resource in ThingLink, which has got user controls. So as a user in ThingLink, you can change stuff such as like the font and the contrast and other options like that. So this made it more inclusive. That was for Newsday 1, but for Newsday 2, we've gone a step further and we've created the entire scenario in ThingLink as well. So all the videos and the transcripts can be accessed as a recap resource for all students. But there's an option at the beginning to either go straight to those resources, or you can actually go through the scenario. So if you can only use a keyboard, say, for mobility issues or such, you can just use that resource for that. Thanks, Dan. So following user testing, we decided to create a flipped learning approach to it. So we created this tutorial video for the headset in particular that we're using, the MetaQuest 2. We didn't find any tutorials online, so we just used Sketchfab and 11's Lab to quickly create this video. I think it took like an hour in the morning to create. So this was provided a week in advance to the students, just so they had a bit of, they were coming fresh into VR, a lot of them. So this was just so they had that initial idea of what was going to happen with the controllers and such. Next slide, please, Dan. Also coming from the user testing was the people didn't really know what hotspots were, so this was really a good shout to put in this menu that popped up at the beginning, so they had an idea of what these hotspots would do and what they would kind of look like. Also, we added this health and safety warning, so if they weren't comfortable, they were just saying how you can adjust the headset and how you can leave the scenario if you're not finding it comfortable enough. Say they could have glasses on, they could be struggling with that. Also, all this was just to reduce the cognitive load as well on the students when they were going to be using these resources. So Newsday 2 has also got a trigger warning due to its dramatic content. So to capture and build, we shot around campus, so there weren't no external locations. We didn't have to put police tape round leads and get funny looks or anything. So we did it on campus. Newsday 1, as we said, used friends and colleagues to record with. And then we hired professional actors. And then we edited the 360 videos and the 2D interview footage separately and overlaid them. But for Newsday 2, we've decided to shoot it all in 360. And we had the help of a colleague, Edwin Long, who came and he pretended to be a camera person with a camera set up in the shop. So this allowed us to capture the 2D footage as well as the 360 footage at the same time. So that really helped with a more effective workflow for us. this graph that's just showing the immersion that people found the scenes really immersive. So that was great. Yep, next slide, Dan, please. I'm rushing through because I'm aware of time. So sorry. For the delivery, we've delivered it in the Helix facility, the innovative area in the University of Leeds. We provided the intro and the demo to start with, and the learning outcomes. At first, they'll do group work and discuss using the AI-generated posts, and then they'll be in and out of VR to do the tasks. So they'll be in VR for the experience, and then they will come out to do the written tasks. And it's scaffolded learning, so the students in first year that did Newsday 1 are now going to move on to Newsday 2 in the second year. So they'll have some of the VR training experience, which will remind them of, and they'll be moving up to then using that experience, getting used to that immersive environment, and then coming into focusing more on the wellbeing side rather than letting the technology take over. Next slide, please, Dan. So yeah, Newsday 1 was really successful. The students gave it 4 and 5 star ratings, and 96.7% wanted further VR experiences. So that's what led on to us working on Newsday 2. Yes, please. Thanks. We've got some student quotes here, so I'll just read them out quickly. So when we asked them to list the things they learnt from today's session, it was how to use VR. I'll always ask follow-up questions and make sure you pay attention to every detail. How will you apply what you've learnt in your future studies and work? I will be able to take on more information, I will be able to apply it, and how to take key facts and verify facts from witnesses, and again, asking those follow-up questions. And this was interesting. How did you feel before, during and after the activity? Before they were slightly nervous about using VR, and then during it they were really engaged, and then after it they felt it was fun and would do it again. Now that's in relation to the drug scene and the Newsday 1 and not the more traumatic one. We're still collecting that data. Newsday 1 won the Innovation and Partnership Award last year for Arts and Humanities and Cultures, and in January it was in the Realism.Co.uk report, which is a industry-wide website, and it's also used as a case study for university-wide initiative on curriculum redefined programme, and we presented it internally and externally. We took it to Vienna last year to present, so that was great. And that's it. We've got the resources there, so we've got Newsday 1 and 2 there. I must mention Newsday 2 because it's pulling it from the scenario servers, and it works on the VR headsets because it's downloaded onto them, but when you're pulling it from there, there's some lagging, so we've just put one scene on just as a tester, but it probably will lag. But the accessible versions work as well. So thank you. Yeah.